So huge welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Really pleased to have you along. My name is Jaime Smith and I'm the Director of the Schools Division at the Anna Freud Centre. And I'm really delighted that you're able to join us again this afternoon for another of our Schools in Mind webinars. Some of you might know that we've been running these webinars for the whole of the last academic year, with the aim really to support teachers and school leaders to prioritise mental health in their setting and to embed good mental health and wellbeing across their whole school community. So previously, our webinars have been focusing on whole school approaches, how you can take a whole school approach to your school setting using our 5 steps framework. And if anyone's interested in finding out more about our 5 steps framework, please do take a look at our website. All of our previous webinars are on there for you to access for free, and all of our information about our whole school approach is there for you to download. But today we've got a specialist webinar, which I'm really pleased about. We're going to be thinking this afternoon about bereavement and particularly focusing on traumatic bereavement. We have a panel of experts, which I'm really excited to introduce you to, and they're going to be helping us to think about what is bereavement and what is traumatic bereavement and how does it differ from normal bereavement, and what are some of the things that we can do to support and help children and young people and their families who might be experiencing traumatic bereavement. So you can see we've got a busy agenda there on the screen. We've got 3 guest speakers, David, Jaime and Beck. And I'm really pleased to welcome David and Beck, who will be joining us from the UK Trauma Council this afternoon. The UK Trauma Council is a group of leading experts from across the UK who bring together for the first time experts in childhood trauma, looking at with expertise in research, in policy, in practice and lived experience. And the UK Trauma Council is hosted here at the Anna Freud Centre. I'm also delighted to welcome Jaime Cronk, who's a specialist teacher who has got lots of experience of supporting children and young people with bereavement in schools. Now, before we go any further, there's a few sort of housekeeping things that I want to do. If I can move my slide on, let's see. So we really want to make this webinar as interactive as we can, as interactive as a Zoom webinar can be. So there are lots of different ways that you can get in contact with us. The first one is through our email address. That's our Schools in Mind email there. If you want to give us any feedback, share anything, let us know anything about the webinar. We also are on social media. So if you want to tweet and get involved, that's our handle AFNCCF. And please use the hashtag Schools in Mind and the UK Trauma Council. And also there'll be opportunity for you to ask questions. You can see from our agenda that we've got 3 speakers, but we'll have time at the end, a good half an hour for you to ask any questions that you want of our panel. If you think of questions, just please pop them into the Q&A tab that you should find at the bottom of your screen. We won't stop after each speaker for questions, but if you think of them, just write them immediately and we'll collate them and save them all for the end, and you'll have an opportunity to get all of your questions answered there. And also importantly, I should say that all of the slides will be shared afterwards. So don't worry about that. They'll all be sent out after the event. So you'll be able to have access to all of those things. So I'm hoping that I'm now able to move on and introduce our first speaker, who is David Trickey. So David is the co-director of the UK Trauma Council and a consultant clinical psychologist. David has specialised in working with traumatised and bereaved children, young people and families for more than 20 years. He continues to focus on direct clinical work as well as the training and supervision of other practitioners. David routinely acts as an expert witness in civil and criminal cases, and in 2018 he was part of the NICE committee to revise guidelines on PTSD. To start today's seminar, David is going to give a clinical overview of both bereavement and traumatic bereavement and how they differ. David, we're delighted to have you here this afternoon, so I'm going to hand over to you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jaime. So let me just tell you a little bit about the UK Trauma Council. It's a project, as Jaime said, that's hosted at the Anna Freud Centre. And we really do have children, young people and their families who have experienced traumatic events at the heart of what we do. And what the council is trying to do is to support those working with those children, young people and families, people such as teachers, therapists, social workers, but also policymakers. And the way that we try to support them is by providing various free resources, guidance and training. So one of our first resources was to do with childhood trauma and the brain, which is a whole suite of different types of resources, videos, animations and booklets to really help people understand how does trauma affect the brain, and then importantly, for me as a therapist, so what? And for you as teachers, so what? What difference does that actually make to those of us working with those children? Every quarter, we do a roundup of important research looking at the impact that trauma has on children. We've just recently produced our traumatic bereavement resources, which I'm going to say a bit more about later on. Of course, we have a website and a YouTube channel, which includes various videos from experts, which are really trying to help us understand some quite difficult concepts. And all the stuff we do, we try as much as is possible to co-create both with the intended users and the children and young people. They're all very firmly based on evidence, and we draw on that expert counsel that Jaime just mentioned. And ideally, by providing that support and help to those working with the children and young people, we're hoping to change the world in terms of the support that traumatized children and young people receive. But let's think about traumatic bereavement. And I should say, I don't know what your own individual experiences have been, not just in the last year, but also previous to that. You know, many of you listening will have experienced bereavements, traumatic or otherwise. And even regardless of your own experiences, as compassionate human beings, we should be moved by these stories. We should be moved when we start to think about traumatically bereaved children and young people. And I should warn you, the animation I'm going to show is necessarily emotive. So I would urge you to take responsibility for yourselves and do whatever you need to do to start to look after yourself. If you start to feel overwhelmed rather than just moved, then think carefully about what you're going to do. Do you need to step away for a little bit and come back later on for the questions? Do you need to talk through what you've been thinking and what you've been feeling with somebody or something? Dogs and cats apparently are better listeners than partners. So some people have told me. So anyway, do what you need to do to look after yourself. We know that in the last year, with the whole pandemic, we've had more than 128,000 UK coronavirus deaths. And some of the characteristics of many of those deaths have been that they're sudden, unexpected, and untimely. People may not have had the opportunity to say goodbye, to prepare themselves for the death because they haven't been able to be there as the person gets more ill. Those who have been bereaved may have had restricted access to the normal grieving rituals. That idea of coming together, for example, at a funeral or at the wake or at some memorial service to actually be with other people and share their grief, share their stories. And inevitably, of course, we've had reduced social support. So not only has the death itself been difficult, but actually the things that we would usually have to help us to adjust to that may have been absent. So what we mean by traumatic bereavement, because not every bereavement is traumatic. When my nan died at 93, peacefully in a hospital bed with her family around her, that was not traumatic. It was sad, and we still miss her, but it was not traumatic. So for a traumatic bereavement, we really think of that as something where there's something about the way that the child or young person experiences or makes sense of the death. And that traumatic nature of the event of the death gets in the way of their natural grieving and adjustment. So for example, if the message of that death is, I am now completely alone, well, that might be really terrifying, and the young person is too busy trying to get their head around that to actually start to grieve their loss. Or if they think the whole world is now dangerous, then they're having to cope with that, or they might think you can't trust anyone. So if the message of the death is that changes the way they see things, that could be considered a traumatic death. And sometimes traumatic memories or just traumatic images of the person's death, they take precedence over the stories of the person's life. So we still talk about my nan. We tell stories about what she used to say and things that she did. Now, if the way she had died had been traumatic, then every time we might try and think about nan, what would happen is we would have a memory of the death and the way that she died. Because that's what happens with traumatic memories. They are volatile and they're vivid, and they pop into our minds unexpectedly, and we feel as if we're re-experiencing the event rather than just remembering a story. Let me give you an example. If this lens here is the way that we see the world, the way that we see things, the way that we view ourselves, the world, and other people. Now, some of the young people we're working with now have had pandemic-related deaths in their families. One boy I'm working with who had a number of family members who were ill, and then a grandparent died. And that event, or those series of events, changed the way he saw things. He started to believe that the whole world was dangerous, that he was vulnerable, and that other people could not be trusted. So even months after that death, he's left with this particular view of things. So as the schools started to return, he would see that return through this lens, which is now tainted, it's now colored by his experiences. So he would think, well, I'll get it, and I'm vulnerable. I might infect other people might get ill, I might die. And that, of course, would make him really scared. And the easiest way to reduce that fear is to not leave the house, is to not go back to school, to not spend time with his friends. But that avoidance then kept his unbalanced views going. So he wasn't able to check them out with his friends. He wasn't able to see that actually going to school where things were really safe, that was okay. So he got really caught in this loop where his avoidance maintained his difficulties. But also he had intrusive memories and images of the death. He said that he could remember the paramedics coming up the stairs to get his granddad. He had an image of what it must have been like for his granddad when he died. And those images kept intruding into his consciousness and reminding him of how dangerous the world is and how vulnerable he was. So that's really, in a nutshell, what we think of as traumatic death, traumatic bereavement. And one of our concerns is that it may be misunderstood or missed by those involved with the child, those that know the child. They may not realize that this is not just a sad bereavement and they're having to adjust to that loss, but actually there's something that's getting in the way of that adjustment. And many of these children and young people will need some additional help and support. What I'd like to do now is to show you an animation that we developed as part of this suite of resources we've developed. One lot of resources is very firmly aimed at teachers and school staff to help them think about traumatic bereavement within their pupils. And one is aimed at those working directly with traumatically bereaved children, young people, such as bereavement practitioners or counselors. So I'm hoping that this is going to work.
You okay?
It's Wesley. It's a while since his dad got ill and died, but I'm still worried. I know bereavement is hard to manage and everyone's grief is individual. It's just that he doesn't seem to be managing life very well.
Some bereavements can be extra tricky. Shall we think about how our other pupils have responded to someone dying?
When I think back to Prisha and her mum dying, she was really sad. It's just that she also had better moments, when she'd share photos of her mum, just wanting to keep her memories of mum alive.
There's an idea that young people often grieve in puddles, dipping in and out of their grief, experiencing strong feelings and then going off to do their usual things in between. Do you think Wesley's stuck in a puddle?
It's more that he's stuck in a well.
Remember Cara? She was really struggling. The bereavement service called it traumatic bereavement.
Traumatic bereavement?
When there is something about the death that is just too much to cope with, and so they keep on struggling.
Isn't all bereavement traumatic?
Well, when someone you know or love dies, it's always going to be really difficult in one way or another, but it won't necessarily be traumatic bereavement.
What makes it traumatic?
There are some circumstances that can make a bereavement more likely to be traumatic.
Well, Cara lost her brother to suicide. I wonder if that was part of making it traumatic.
Plus, there had already been a lot of difficulties in her past. But it's about the trauma of the death getting in the way of grieving the loss. Because the death changes the way they see things. It sort of colours their view of everything. The world, other people, even themselves. It's about what meaning they make of the death.
Could Wesley's bereavement be traumatic? He didn't see anything awful.
But he could have imagined it. You said he struggled with not being able to visit Dad in hospital. Couldn't say goodbye or be with his mum when Dad was dying. We know it wasn't his fault. But maybe he feels he let his mum and Dad down.
He can't bear to look at his dad's photos. It's just too painful because all his mind can think of is his mum being alone when his dad died and not being able to say goodbye.
For Cara, she was so frightened by what happened to her brother, the whole world became a scary place.
At first, we didn't see Cara's fear, just her angry outbursts. Maybe it's the same with Wesley.
It's so hard to know what to expect with grief. It's so individual, isn't it?
Yeah, but it might be useful to think about what they were like before the death. How much have they changed? Are these changes still overwhelming them often? Is anything starting to get easier, or is it still really hard? And it is important to think about their history. Have you talked this through with Mum?
Yes, Mum agrees. There's definitely a big change in Wesley since his dad died. He's not so motivated. He's lost his spark. His academic work is taking a nosedive. At first I thought fair enough. I expected him to be doing better by now. But if anything, things might be getting worse. Maybe this is traumatic bereavement. What should I do?
It's already a big help that you have noticed his difficulties and have him in mind. Keep the relationship going. The communication, the trust and the care. And then let's talk about a specialist referral to help Wesley address his trauma and grieve his loss. If we stick with Wesley and his mum, I'm hopeful that things will get better.
Sorry about the rather abrupt ending there, that was my fault. So that's the animation that we produced in order to help people to start thinking about when a bereavement might be traumatic and what might need to be done to help the child or young person. And if you look at our website, you'll find the completely free resources there for those working in schools and colleges, that animation, a comprehensive guide, which really tells you what to do and gives you some idea. It doesn't tell you what to do. It has some ideas for what you might want to do that might be useful. It has a lot of tools that you can use, some videos that you might find helpful, handouts for parents, handouts for the young people. And also we've developed some training sessions designed for Senkos, mental health leads or pastoral leads, really anyone who is heading up that sort of work within the schools. And within the schools guide and the toolkit, one of the things we have there is a 6-point support plan, which I just want to tell you a little bit about. So one of the things you can do is to build that relationship. So the message here really is not you outsource this to someone else. You don't just refer on to the specialist and leave them to do it, because actually when something extraordinary has happened to a child, what they need is lots of extraordinary. They need those people that are familiar, that are predictable, that they already have a relationship with. So in fact, I don't want to put any more pressure on teachers than you already have on you, but your role is absolutely crucial in terms of a reliable adult that they already know and trust. So that relationship is absolutely crucial to the well-being of those young people. And then whichever one or whichever few of you in each school has that relationship, we need to make sure that you're supported in that as well. You're not just left to get on with it. Liaising and working together with home as much as is possible tends to be really important and really useful, and just keeping an eye on them. Some children and young people will actually adjust to what's happened to them, but we want to check in with them and make sure things are heading in the right direction. And you may need to refer on to a specialist support service and also hold that hope. And we saw that in the video at the end. It might be that sometimes holding the hope means just noticing the times it's not so bad. So it's not just absolutely dreadful all the time. There are some days where it's not too bad, and gradually those days and those moments will be more frequent and last for longer. So as I said, all of that is available on the website uktraumacouncil.org. So I'm going to finish there, if that's okay.
Thank you, David. I've seen that animation several times, and I still find it incredibly powerful and just incredibly useful for use in school. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next speaker, and I'm really pleased to introduce Jaime Cronk. Jaime has 20 years experience working in both mainstream and specialist schools as a teacher. Jaime currently works as a specialist outreach teacher across Maidstone, supporting pupils in primary and secondary schools with social, emotional and mental health needs. As part of this role, Jaime supports school leaders and Senkos through training and helping schools to develop inclusive policies and systems to enable pupils to thrive. Jaime has worked extensively with bereaved children and young people, as well as supporting SENCOs and other education professionals to support bereaved children and families. And today, Jaime is going to be sharing some of her experiences and real-life school examples of supporting children and young people with traumatic bereavement. Really pleased to welcome you along, Jaime. Thanks for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Jaime. You don't often get two Jaimes on a presentation. It's just nice to meet another Jaime. And I'm just going to have to try to share my screen again because it's not playing. Let's have a look. Okay. I can't see if that's working. Okay, so as Jaime said, I'm working for Maidstone Specialist Teaching Service in Kent, and it's my absolute pleasure to share my experiences today with you. Jaime, can you actually see that? Because I can't see my screen. Are you able to?
So at the moment, I can't see your slides. It's just
okay. Let's try again.
Don't worry. These things are always more tricky.
Of course. Let's try that. That should be working.
There we go. Perfect.
Right. Brilliant. Okay, fabulous. Sorry about that, everyone. It's always so difficult, isn't it, when you're on the spotlight, so to speak. So yes, as Jaime says, my role is to support schools, and so I work from primary and secondary schools in Maidstone in Kent, and I work with a lot of children with SEMH needs, and unfortunately this part of life that a lot of the children I work with have experienced the bereavement, and I'm really privileged to be able to share those experiences with you today. Hopefully some of the insights I hope to share with you today will give you a bit of reassurance that some of the experiences at schools across the country are very similar to yours, and perhaps some of the observations of some of your children would be the same as others too. They're insights into individual children I have worked with, but also some some school-based work as well. Okay, let's hope that this works. Fantastic. So as Jaime was saying, I've worked in mainstream and special schools for over 20 years, with various roles within that. But my current role is working as a specialist teacher in Maidstone, where I support children with ASC needs as well as SEMH needs. So hopefully some of the insights today will be familiar to you. The children come to me with after request from our LIFT process, which is a local inclusion forum team, where the permission is granted from an adult with parental responsibility. The presenting needs of the children are discussed, obviously all with parental acknowledgement that this is going to happen. We're fully aware that all behaviour is communication, but knowing what has happened to these children can help put these behaviours into context and into obviously perspective for our insights and the support that we often give. Sometimes not all the details are discussed, and families are in control of what is shared within the supported network. We then try to focus on solutions about what can be done and what is possible to be achieved within that, and also what the child or young person does want and what does need within that support. And then obviously making sure that people know what their responsibilities are within that. You know, throughout my job, I'm incredibly humbled and amazed by the care and support school staff often give the most vulnerable children the support, and obviously the families within that, and the diligence and the time spent. Unfortunately, as part of my role, the staff often don't want to see me, but I hope that the reassurance and emotional support I give and some of the practical advice I offer allows the staff to be able to continue to help pupils feel safe and secure and give them that sense of belonging that they're craving. And this is obviously particularly true if a member of the school community has experienced a bereavement, and obviously particularly with a traumatic bereavement. So who do I see when I visit schools? I get a call sometimes, and obviously with my colleagues as well, we get an immediate call for response, because the first question is, what do we do? How can we help? Often it's the fact that they don't want to do the wrong thing, and they feel that they're just helpless, and that overwhelming sense is that they just are really aware that they don't want to, you know, to do anything wrong as such. We talk through what the presenting needs are, any observable behaviours, and we try to discuss what these behaviours may mean. And obviously, like that David was saying about through that lens, what does that mean for that child or young person? And then we put together a plan with the whole team, and making sure that there are identifiable actions included within that. I meet with the SENCO, the pastoral teams, senior leaders, And then obviously we decide whether an observation within the classroom is needed, it's required. And then obviously with the class teams, then we make sure that support is all there. All the support is dependent on their child's needs and their experiences, and obviously sometimes their developmental needs are important to acknowledge too. The staff, like the staff included in the animation, often feel that their child is stuck, and they just need to sometimes talk through what is happening. And mostly I give them a lot of reassurance that they are doing everything right, and obviously everything that is possibly can be done that is often in place. And I'm just there to just give them that reassurance and giving them that gentle, you're fine, it's okay. So what do I see? So what are the presenter needs that I often see within schools, and what concerns do the staff raise? Often staff do have concerns surrounding attendance, just like the lad in David's presentation. Some children and young people have sporadic attendance, some often have no attendance at all, and obviously sometimes, and understandably so, the younger children have good attendance, but sometimes the older children have dip in and out of lessons, and they often choose depending on the relationship that they have with the teachers and the adults within those lessons. And that goes back to what David was saying about making sure that those relationships are kept going. In primary schools, they notice that whilst children are previously able to engage well in lessons, their ability to be proactive in those lessons and to attend in those lessons take a massive dip often. And they often make a conscious decision almost to withdraw from social situations. Pupils across key stages have been observed to have decreased ability to accept any challenges or feel that they can take on anything new. And also anything new or any new experience can often throw them because they're just almost keeping their head above water a lot of the time. So any new challenges that are thrown at them, they just do not feel it almost inconceivable that they can take anything like that on. There are often observable changes in how they interact with people. This can include familiar staff as well as their peers. So one girl I was working with became very insular. Before her bereavement, she had a very, very wide circle of friends. But after her bereavement, she was unable to almost take on the responsibility of having so many friends. And she just had one good close friendship that she confided in, and she was her confidant, and obviously staff were quite concerned about that lack of peer relationships that she had, but we were trying to look at from her lens, and like I said, might be her way of not being able to have the energy to look after other people's emotions and look after other people's things that were going on in their lives too. So it was important that at least she had one good friend in her life. But this young lady as well also withdrew from some of the relationships with the strong adults that she had in her life too. So we needed to make sure the staff relationships that she had, and those members of staff showed good resilience for her as well, and they kept that relationship going. But it was also making sure that it wasn't just conversations in the class, in the corridor in between lessons, and those conversations weren't just how are you, just as they were just about to to skip to the next lesson. They needed to be made sure that they were time dedicated for her, and that she had time to process that question. And obviously that how are you question is never a good question to ask anyway, because how is she is never a good question to ask when she's been experiencing what she's been going through. What else do I see? And another secondary student that I worked with, she changed her appearance quite significantly. She started to wear an awful lot of makeup, much to the frustration of her secondary school. And we never really got to the bottom of that lens for that young lady. But some of the kind of like queries that we had, and some of the our thought process around that was whether she was masking her feelings, and that was almost like a barrier for her. But it might be also creating a new persona, that she wasn't just the label of the girl who'd had a bereavement, but it also, one of the things that we thought of as well, that it might have been a way of giving the school another thing to talk to her about, rather than just her bereavement. So that the first conversation was, oh, how are you doing? It was why are you wearing all that makeup? Because it was quite a strong policy within the school not to have a lot of makeup on. So it was almost like a distraction for her. And also that, it was, although she had a lot of makeup that she was wearing. Another child I worked with, his ability to self-care was kind of took a bit of a nosedive, and he also stopped attending his football training sessions in the week, and then he just withdrew from the football matches that he used to love previously. But for this young lad who could find social situations quite difficult, was it so hard for him to be social and to attend and be engaged within his school environment that he'd almost had enough, and he couldn't cope anymore with being social or interactive in another context at another time, and then that's his way of coping at that. So, you know, school was enough for him to manage at that time. Social media, I mean, obviously we all have our own opinions about social media and the different platforms that are available for our teenagers, and obviously it can be cause quite a lot of distress for all our youngsters and children from a young age too. But for one girl I was working with, she was a year 11 student I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. She used social media as her kind of distraction tool, and she gathered in the end almost 10,000 followers on Instagram, which is just a crazy amount for me. I just can't get my head around it really. And we were talking about this once and her use of Instagram and her use of social media. And she told me that if she put a photograph up on Instagram, if within an hour she didn't have 1,000 likes, she would take it off, because it was her way of saying that that photograph isn't good enough, and it was just her way of controlling that. And obviously that was something that we needed to be take quite a lot of careful consideration how we were going to manage that, because obviously that sort of behaviour is quite worrying and distressing for her. But obviously, you know, like I said, social media can cause quite a lot of upset for a lot of our youngsters, but for children who are going through a bereavement, it can cause quite a lot of, can be a root of even further upset. So when I worked in the special school, I had he was a year 4 student at the time. His mum sadly passed away, and I had a very good relationship with his dad, who kind of communicated throughout the illness and her untimely death. And unfortunately, because of his social communication difficulties, his way of processing that death was very difficult for him to manage. And his dad explained to me that on telling him about his death of his mum, he responded with "Does that mean I will get a new mummy?" And obviously for his dad and other members of the family, that was caused quite a lot of distress. So we needed to be very careful as a school team and as a class team, as well as the school, obviously, and the family, to make sure that we had a consistent use of language, a consistent use of this is what we're talking about, and the use of words and vocabulary that we mentioned when he asked us any questions. And obviously we had to respond with an awful lot of care, consistency, and obviously support and love that he needed to be nurtured to get him through that very difficult part of his life. But obviously then, whilst this lad found it very difficult to understand or process what had happened, because of his social communication difficulties, some children and obviously some adults find it difficult to manage emotions and to manage different emotions at the same time. Like in the illustration there, we almost sometimes with bereavement hold on to different emotions at the same time. So for one young lady I worked with, she was experiencing the death of her father. And she explained about that she felt obviously sad that her dad had died, but also that, you know, that she was quite happy on occasions, because when people came to visit, they brought her presents. And then I'm almost going to throw a third emotion into there, because then she felt guilt about feeling happy when she should be feeling sad. So it was, you know, and a lot of her behaviours of the coming out of school was quite chaotic, quite you know, one minute that she was okay, and one minute then she was just all over the place and incredibly emotional, because she couldn't almost deal with all those emotions at the same time. Some younger children, this is sort of like in conversations I've had with some colleagues, some younger children have been left quite confused with emotions as well, because they've heard lots of conversations perhaps behind closed doors, and some of those conversations perhaps can be quite highly emotive. But then, and obviously then adults perhaps talking in code around them, but then in front of them, into their face, then the adults are trying to be jolly. So it's really important that the children know what they need to know and what they can developmentally understand about what has happened, and that the right words are used within that as well. So then what next? What do we see? So it's about making sure that the plan is communicate with all involved. But it's really important, like the lad I was talking about with an autistic spectrum condition, sometimes children with developmental or neurological needs, that the pathways for around that can be very, very tricky, because perhaps if the difficulties were there previous, I mean, the pathways are even trickier already, but you know, perhaps if there's a bereavement that's happened, that those pathways can be very difficult to then navigate. And then obviously paediatricians and child mental health services can ask schools to kind of like almost manage the moment and look what's happening in the here and now. So it's important that schools have the awareness of who to ask for help and to support, because as David said in his presentation, it's really important that schools know who and how and when to ask for help, but it's important to, you know when, what and how to help as well whilst in school, and the school-based response. And obviously the traumatic bereavement guide is it's a perfect resource for all schools to be managing students with such difficulties. But it's a perfect example of why, when we're thinking about those pathways, that we need to make sure that we keep a track of any subtle or marked changes within our students, because then if we are looking at external agencies, they need to know what has happened and the frequency and the times and the how long these behaviours have been happening. And that this is including of talk about communication with the young person. The young lady I was talking to you about earlier on, she was in year 11, and her grammar school was very careful about her timetable and wanted to decrease her workload and made sure that her workload included just the core subjects. But she, in one conversation, she communicated to me, but it means they've taken PE off me, and that was her one time during the week that she looked forward to and that she excelled in and she loved doing. So it's making sure that the young person is communicated to as well with all this. It's really important to remember as well that as in the animation, the adults working with these children are going to be looked after too. So for example, when I go into schools, I will pick up straight away how the adults are feeling towards the children. And obviously if I'm able to pick up your emotions and not the adults' emotions, and I'm a stranger or perhaps a face who's only coming in every a couple of weeks, the children will pick up on your emotions too. So it's make sure that you are keeping in check and in tune with your emotions, and if you're not the right person to deal with that child or young person at that day, that you need to know who to support, get support from within your schools too. And just to say thank you ever so much for letting me share some of my insights today. Once again, I'm absolutely humbled and thankful for all your support in schools of recognising that these children need your support. And I know how much work is done within schools up and down the country. So once again, thank you ever so much for your support on behalf of all the youngsters that you're working with. And thank you for allowing me to share my insights this evening.
Thank you, Jaime. That was just so interesting to hear about all the different work that you're doing and all of the support that you're providing to schools, and really helpful to have some really practical examples there. Lots of questions were coming in, so we'll have some questions at the end. We're going to move on to our final speaker now, and our final speaker is Beck Ferrari. Beck's early career was as a teacher and a Senko, and she now has her own independent bereavement service working therapeutically with children and young people and supporting education settings. Beck is the clinical co-lead for the UK Trauma Council's recent work on traumatic bereavement, and we're really delighted to have you here, Beck. So I'm going to hand over to you because you're going to be sharing us some practical tips for schools.
Thank you so much, Jaime. A really great opportunity to be speaking to so many people that work in schools today. I'm kind of here wearing both of my hats, although none of them visible on my head. One in my independent work as a child bereavement specialist, and also in my role in developing the resources for the UK Trauma Council around traumatic bereavement. So Jaime has just mentioned my kind of my role and where I've been as a teacher and as Senko, and now working independently as a child bereavement specialist, and still regularly. I've been in 2 schools today before I got here, working with schools, early year settings, colleges to support bereaved pupils. That might be through offering the school team some training, it might be through some consultancy, and then very much with doing some direct work with those children that need some specialist support, as well as my role with the UK Trauma Council. I thought what might be helpful for us this evening is to think about how schools can offer support kind of in tiers. And I thought I'd draw on this model by the Childhood Bereavement Network, which encourages us to think about what do all our bereaved children need, what do some of them need on the top of that, and what will a few of them need. And I guess when we're thinking about the children in that animation earlier, Wesley, and we're thinking about Cara, they're likely to be at the top of that tier and need that few. We'll have some children that will need all of the all of the some, and there might be some that are kind of on that boundary wondering, is this a traumatic bereavement? So hopefully we can shed some light on thinking about that as well. So at that first tier, we're thinking about what all bereaved children will need. We're thinking about the information that we need working in schools about how children and young people grieve. It's estimated that about 23,000 children each year are bereaved of a parent. We don't know quite what the impact of COVID will have on that, but we expect that to be an increase. And I think it's really important that we recognise that in the way that COVID has disproportionately affected minoritized communities and disadvantaged communities, so also are the bereavements and the children that are bereaved overrepresented in those communities as well. And information really is the basis, because in a way, if we don't know what to expect from a bereavement, how will we know how to support? And also, how will we know when to be worried? We're not suggesting that bereavement all follows the same journey, the same trajectory. That is very much individual, but I guess we need some kind of core understanding of how bereavement might affect children, so that we can then work out when we're more worried. So thinking about resources, there's a whole plethora of amazing resources that various child bereavement services put together. I particularly like one that the Child Bereavement UK put together with the London Grid for Learning, which I think is a great toolkit for schools on how to support bereaved children. There's lots of training that you can access from national as well as local child bereavement services. So I'd encourage you to see what might be happening locally in your area, as well as the traumatic bereavement training that we're offering through the UK Trauma Council. I think policy, whilst it's the dry end of work in schools, is actually really helpful in creating a platform, in creating a way of anticipating and considering our responses so that we're able to be active in those responses when someone in our school community is grieving. And then I'll also highlight at the Child Bereavement Network, they have a fantastic Growing in Grief Awareness kind of award that encourages schools to kind of audit what they've got available and then see where their gaps might be and where they might be able to grow in grief awareness. And that really is the fundamental, the basis for bereavement support. And then the second part of that lowest tier is thinking about existing support networks. And I guess that's why we're here, because as schools, you are those existing support networks. And really, you are ideally placed because you already know that individual child. You've already got a relationship with them. You know about their family and maybe have had a lot to do with that family, or maybe less so, but maybe you're going to be looking to have a little bit more involvement with them. And then crucially, you have some understanding of the family context. So when we're thinking about the family's faith, any socioeconomic disadvantage they might and challenges they might be having, as Jaime was talking a lot about children with developmental or neurodiverse difficulties, and all that awareness of the child and the family and their context can mean that we can make a really sensitive and thoughtful response to them. Also within that school, you've got connections with other support networks. Is this a family that have been supported by young carers organisations? Have they been supported by other local services and charities? And can you connect with those and see what support they can offer, so that the support that young person can access isn't just between the 9 and 3, but can be before and after school as well. And then fundamentally for me, it's that team of caring human beings, which I think makes schools ideally placed. Because I think most of you who work in schools, it will be because of your compassion and interest, rather than necessarily some of the other things, that the harder bits that come into play in everyday life in schools. I remember some years ago being asked to present at a head teachers conference, and I asked a group of bereaved young people I was working with, tell me what's happened in schools your school has done that's really supported you, and then tell me what you think that you would have liked, and therefore I can use that as a basis for my presentation. And I'll never forget those young people talking about the teacher who shared their Kit Kat with them at break time, the midday supervisor who walked round and round the field with them while they swore and let off a lot of steam. They talked about things that probably those members of staff were just incidental kindness, but actually that clearly had a big impact on those young people. So really, if you can take something from this evening about that active care, that when we do that for children and young people, we connect with them, and they do look back with a great sense of how important that was to them. I can think of one school particularly who, after having, whilst a small village school, they set up a memorial garden. They'd had a number of children whose parents had died in quite a short space of time, considering the size of their school population. And they set up a small memorial garden. And as part of that, they had lots of large cobbles and stones. And the school community were encouraged, if somebody important in their life had died, to go and get a stone from the head teacher and to be able to decorate it and show the head teacher and place it in the memory garden. And that gave all those children somewhere to go if it was a tough day, or just a tough half an hour, or a tough lunchtime. I remember the head teacher saying to me how important, she hadn't appreciated how important that would be, but that gave her a reason to connect with every bereaved child, because every one of those children had to come to her and ask for a stone, and they might take her out to show her how they decorated them. And I think when we're thinking about an existing support network for all bereaved children, those, including those that have been traumatically bereaved, let's start with all those things that you're already doing, and build on there. And then when we think about some bereaved children, we're thinking about some who need that little bit extra. One of the places, if you don't know what your local bereavement service is, have a quick look at the Childhood Bereavement Network website, where they have a great tool that you can use by postcode or by map of the UK, and you can see there how widely dispersed child bereavement services are. And lots of those that look like they're only one in a large area actually cover a really vast area. So I'd really encourage you to find and link up with your local service to find what they could offer. But also, what are the services you've already got in schools? I think schools are so well equipped in many ways in offering emotional wellbeing support, and some of them having counsellors or nurture groups, and thinking, what can we offer on a one-to-one for this child? What can we signpost the family to? And is there a role for peer support in here? And for this one, I really want to mention Treasured Memories Days that I've run in a number of schools in Kent. One particular school really have taken this as a commitment to offer their bereaved children. So twice a year, pre-COVID, twice a year I've been into that school and run a day for any of their bereaved children to attend by invitation. They can opt to come or they can opt not to come, but many of them come over a long period of time. I'm thinking of one little girl who was bereaved when she was year 1, and she came every year through to the end of year 6. And for her, we could see her growing journey. Her dad so appreciated the fact that this wasn't a one-off support, this was going to be ongoing, and that she could keep bringing her different feelings as she revisited her grief at different ages, and it meant different things to her. It meant we could support her through some other life changes that were happening. And what I really liked about it is that the day would go on from registration in the morning until the end of the day, and throughout the day, teachers and teaching assistants were released to go and drop in to that group and just kind of pop in. And lots of the teachers said, in going to sit down next to the child in their class who was there, they could have an everyday conversation about this thing that they didn't know how to talk about, because they could sit and look at the patchwork they were making, or they could sit and help them thread some beads, or they could help them throw their water balloons to let out some of their cross feelings. And that really enabled teachers to connect with those children and have conversations that maybe they didn't feel so confident in having. And also that power of peer support that we had some from the youngest children in year R all the way through to year 6s, supporting each other at different stages in their grief in terms of how long it had been, but all having something to offer and something to learn from each other at different ages. And then if we think about that top tier of the pyramid, we're thinking about that specialist support, and that few children will need. Many children with great support from their school and from their home and from their local community will manage and adapt to their grief. We have Prisha in the animation who's dipping in and out of her puddles, and we can see that she's sad, but we can also see that she can engage with her friends and do some other things she was doing. And I'd like to think that with good support from school and family, Prisha would be able to adjust to her grief. But then we see Wesley, who's clearly having some more difficulties. What indicators are there that a pupil is struggling? I think us knowing about the child before can be really helpful, because then we can see how much of a marked change is this, how severe and how frequent are the difficulties they're having. It's much easier for us to spot the difficulties which are being externalized, and maybe a little bit more tricky for us to notice things which are much more internal. David talked about the way the child is seeing the world. It's quite unlikely that a child will come up to you and say, hey, since this happened, I'm seeing the world like this. But if we're connecting with that young person, we might be able to work out something about the responses they're making in daily life, and whether that might mean that they no longer trust people, or they feel an enhanced unsafety in the world around. And then how long should I wait before I seek help? A really difficult one to just put on a slide there. I think in part it will depend on the level of risk and the level the impact that bereavement is having. But I wouldn't say we need to give it a definite time frame. We would expect children to be dipping out of puddles and having some sense of overwhelming feelings. But when that starts to persist and seems to be really having an impact on the child or young person across a variety of areas of their life, then we might want to be thinking about what more should we be doing and who might be able to help. I'd go back to that slide I shared with your local bereavement service to think about, are they able to support specialist traumatic bereavements as well? And many are. And maybe in conversation with them and the young person and the family, think about, might this be an occasion where actually the presentation of the bereavement is actually presenting as mental health difficulties, that the young person is struggling with post-traumatic symptoms or depression or anxiety or difficulties managing frustration and behaviour, and actually maybe they would now benefit from support from NHS mental health services as well. And then what can we do to support in school? And I think that's really important. Remember, when we get to the top of the tier, we're not just going to be doing that. We're going to be doing all the layers, all of the sum, and this, especially this top layer about what the few will need the specialist support. I'm thinking of a young woman we interviewed as part of the traumatic bereavement resources. And one of the things, it's a video you might want to look up that you'll find on our YouTube channel or on the UK Trauma Council website. One of the things that she spoke about, which was quite striking, is that when the school were able to access some support for her, some specialist support, there was a sense that they stepped away. They thought, oh good, there's someone else here to deal with that, to give her an hour a week. But actually she was still managing school all of the other hours of the week. So we're really thinking about specialist support being an addition to, rather than instead of. So I'd urge you, if you are worried about a child or a young person and you're not sure, to have a look at that schools guide that David has mentioned. Look through the indicators of how we might identify traumatic bereavement and monitor those who are struggling, as well as then look to seeing how we might best support them in schools. I think with traumatic bereavement, we're looking at a child potentially needing both things, something to help address their trauma and grieve their loss. And it may be you can find those things combined through a local child bereavement service or an NHS mental health service, or indeed another specialist service. But we're looking for someone that can offer that. And as part of that response from the UK Trauma Council, we've also thought about those who work therapeutically. That might be as counsellors or therapists or bereavement practitioners, giving those additional tools that they might want to help them work with children who've been traumatically bereaved, including some measures for how they might be able to identify some of the difficulties that child or young person is having, and a lot of information on particular activities and approaches they might use to help children with specific needs. And there is also some training for that. And I guess I'm telling you because I know there's a really mixed audience on the call on this evening's webinar, but also because if you've got people in schools who work as therapists and counsellors, they might also want to know about those resources to kind of add to and enhance their current practice. So when we're thinking about specialist support, we're really thinking about Wesley, who's stuck in the well, and we're thinking about how we can extend our reach. And I guess the first thing is for us to think about support for you, whether you're the key adult, the trusted adult doing that support, or whether you've got a role in supporting that adult, but to make sure they're getting enough support, because it can be quite heavy physically and emotionally to feel that you're closely working with a young person, chatting with them in the corridor, inviting them to come and help you clear up the art cupboard or whatever. But there can be a big impact, because the child or young person's trauma is going to be very painful, and whether or not they can share that with you, there's something about us connecting with the weight that they're carrying. And then think about keeping that relationship going, and how you might do that. And I think that idea that every interaction is an intervention is really helpful here, that we don't need to be doing something very specialist, but actually us keeping the relationship going by the chat we have with that young person when they're in the corridor and say, good to see you today. Just to acknowledge we've noticed them when in the world they're feeling maybe quite overlooked, quite unsafe, that we've said, good to see you today, that we've said, thanks for having a go with your coursework, or well done for getting your homework in, because sometimes there can have been an extraordinary amount of effort to do that, and us acknowledging that can really be important for that young person. I'm also reminded of when Jaime was talking about that question that we ask, and is that the right question? Shall I say, how are you? And kind of in Britain, there's only two answers, aren't there? I'm fine or okay. And actually, I'm not sure how much room there is for children and young people to really give us a different answer. So I wonder whether we could just tweak that question a little bit, and you'll have your own ways of doing that. But I wonder when we say, how are you today? Whether that opens up the conversation, because it says about how are you doing today? And maybe a young person then feels better able to respond, I'm having a pretty difficult day, or just a nod. And that nod tells you that maybe it's not so good, or maybe they'll be say, oh yeah, my football team won last night, or whatever happened. We're all hopeful of this, aren't we, with the Euros going on? But so maybe that might not be the question to ask, but something about that question, how are you doing today? I think it'd be helpful for us to keep in mind that trauma memories are harder to think about and to talk about, as David was talking about, the way that trauma memory behaves, and how it changes the way the child views the world. And therefore, it's quite likely that children who are affected by traumatic bereavement might be wanting to avoid that memory, and have difficulty talking about it. And actually, that's really important information for us if we're thinking about referring on. We're able to say to the bereavement service, to the NHS service, actually, we've noticed that they're really unable to even cope with mentioning dad, or they're unable to cope with our mention about, should we do something for your sibling who's a part of the school community, and we want to put up a photo, we want to put up a plaque or something. And that all really helps us understand how they're managing. And then it's looking at how we can build connection when the communication might be hard. So can we have those good to see you, that connection about shared interests? Can we have conversations that enable children? And in the training we're offering, we're looking at some ways that you might be able to have those difficult conversations from wherever the young person is. And they might be, back off, don't talk to me about my grief. But still, we're seeking to have a connection, even if the grief isn't something they feel they can talk about with you, through to those children and young people who are really wanting to have some way of talking about this thing, which is so big they don't even know how to put it into words. And then finally thinking there about holding the hope, about how as teachers and adults in schools, you are so well positioned to be able to remind a child or young person about their future and about the hopes you've got. And that even though, like Wesley, he's stuck in the well right now, I like to think that the teacher sitting there with him holding the ball is inviting him back. When you're ready, love to have you back in basketball team. We really miss you. Just that idea that life, whilst it is really hard right now, we hope that in the future can be different. And that might be from everything from inviting them back to a club to supporting them to write their UKAS statement, which might be something that's kind of gone off the boil with everything else happening. And it might be to inviting them to sing a solo in the next school performance or something, but something that you know you can see would be something quite special for them. So really thinking about if tonight has prompted your interest in this area, and you think actually there is a child, there is a young person I'm concerned about, I encourage you to have a look at the traumatic bereavement training for schools and colleges, where we can unpack some of the things we've introduced today in a little bit more detail. It's a morning session. We're suggesting it's for people who take kind of a leading role in child mental health in their school, and it's a small group, and therefore rather than tonight when we're talking to many hundreds of you at once, there'll be we hope to be able to have some consultancy and for you to share some of the concerns you've got and benefit from the tutors and particularly the shared expertise of the many of you on the call. on that webinar. So if you're interested in that, please do look at the website and have a look to book onto that. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity for this. Thank you, Jaime.
Thanks, Beck. So many useful and practical tips there. I was really struck by the one about decorating stones. That was such a great example and a way of involving the head teacher. And as you say, the head teacher being able to speak to individuals. Thank you, Beck. So, right, we've now got time for questions. So I'm going to invite the whole panel back. So if I can bring back Beck, David and Jaime. And I also just want to say you've made my job as a chair so easy because you were perfectly on time. So well done to everyone. I often share things and people are not on time. So you were really great. So thank you very much for that. We've had lots and lots of questions come through. So I'm going to just dive straight in if that's okay. The first one, I'm going to direct it to David, but everyone join in. David, someone's asked the question, what's the difference between traumatic bereavement and traumatic grief? You're on mute. Yeah, sorry, you knew that.
Yeah, and as the question said, they're often confused, and they are, and there isn't a clear definition. So you can have diagnoses. There are now diagnoses of different types of grieving, but we steered away from that. And the reason we use the phrase traumatic bereavement rather than traumatic grief is because it very much is about the sense the person makes of the event or the way they experience it. And it's not that there's something wrong with the way they're grieving. This is their reaction to the event that was traumatic. So they are confusing terms, and they will remain confused. And I suppose for us, that's the reason we chose traumatic bereavement rather than traumatic grief.
Thank you, that's helpful. Beck, I don't know if you wanted to add anything there.
No, not particularly. If you're really interested in this, look at the clinical guide. There's a whole section on the different descriptions of grief and what we're kind of trying to explain with traumatic bereavement. And that's if you've got some bedtime reading that you want.
Thank you. So we've had a number of questions about kind of timings, and Beck, you touched on this in your presentation, but that idea of when should you start supporting a child through bereavement, and the person that asked the question said that they had been told that you shouldn't support a child in the first 6 months. It'd be interesting to know what the panel think about that. At what point should you start trying to provide support for a child? When is the right time? Do you do it straight away or do you need to wait? And Beck, you talked about this in your presentation, so I'll start with you.
I mean, my thoughts are the first time you have an interaction with them, the support starts then. It might be quite different support than what you were able to offer later down the line. Someone once described it as a bit of one of those snow globes, that everything's really shaken up. So the support that the child or young person needs right now when everything's shaking up might be about safety and connection and feeling okay with those emotions. And then as the snow starts to settle, that might be a time to do some more work around memories and some of the lovely work that bereavement services and schools do about making memory boxes. That might be too painful right at the beginning. And that's where this kind of 6 month idea comes in. But I think the support starts on day one. More formal support, I guess we're going to be in tune with the child and the young person and the family about what they think is an okay time for them when they feel ready for that. But I think particularly in traumatic bereavement, if we're sensing that this is quite difficult for this child, we don't want to lose those opportunities, because sometimes the meaning that's been made of those events actually could be ironed out if the child has different information, and they start to, oh, it wasn't what I thought, it was more like this. So they're my thoughts on the timing. It's kind of fluid and in response to the child or young person.
Thanks, Beck, that's helpful. So just to clarify on the idea of waiting for 6 months, no, we should.
I know that some services will suggest that, and I do understand that in terms of if you're going to join a group where there's an expectation that you'll be able to tell your story and make a memory jar, it may be that some months, and that might be 6 months, gives you some time for that kind of snowstorm to settle a little bit, so you can do that. But I think probably the support starts at the beginning, in tune and at pace with the child. That would be my
Thank you. Jamie, you gave some really useful practical tips, and a couple of people have said, can you share the weekly log? You gave like a kind of a screenshot of the weekly log, which looks fantastic. Is that a practical resource that you'd be willing to share with people?
That's actually from the guide. It's all in the traumatic bereavement guide, so I pinched it from there. So yes, get it from the guide. I think often when I go into schools, obviously we look at, schools are fantastic at creating paperwork, but I've never been a person who does paperwork for paperwork's sake. But I think a lot of the times when we're looking at children's behaviour, we need to keep a track on what's happening, and some of the weekly logs are just a good way of keeping a check on it, and also as well to give us a bit of reassurance that actually things aren't as bad as we think. I think teachers, we've got a very our default sometimes is to look at the black spot on the plain piece of white paper, haven't we? But actually, if we keep in a check and keep in a log, actually we might notice that that there is a little bit more of hope that things are improving, rather than thinking, oh, he's had a bad day. Actually, there was just one blip, and actually the rest of the day was okay. And what does that blip mean? What does that mean for that young person? And was there anything that we could have done differently to help support that, so that blip didn't happen, so that it won't happen again tomorrow? So I think those logs are really, really important to give us a bit of reassurance, as well as adults supporting that young person, that things are improving, as well as possibly creating evidence to then help with any further specialist referrals on.
Thank you. So that's brilliant. That's a free resource that everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great, and I can see that it's just been put in the chat there, so the link directly so people can download that. Just to stick with resources, Jamie, someone had mentioned the idea of using storytelling. Have you got any examples or suggestions, or any of the panel, in terms of books or resources or stories that we could use with children?
I might refer to Beck, because Beck's got an amazing library of resources of storytelling, and I think that if you go onto Amazon and click on stories for children on bereavement, I think you could spend a small fortune. And I think as practitioners and teachers, you kind of rely on the same stories, don't you? But I think, Beck, you've got a vast library of resources, haven't you?
I do love children's books. I think there are a whole range of resources we can use to support children at different ages and different stages, and even some of those picture books, which might look like they're for a younger audience, can give a really powerful message to a teenager. Even I'm trying to think of the best way. I've got a whole book list of that, and I'm wondering, there are in the schools guide, actually there is a whole section of bereavement books, so I'd encourage people to look at those and find some of the titles that might be suitable, and then not to get hung up on what they look like, whether they look like a book for a young child, because that author, that illustrator, kind of nailed a really helpful point in quite a helpful way. And then I also do a lot of story writing with the child or for the child, where we can't find a story that exactly matches their circumstances, and it seems important to give them some messages. Then let's borrow a book that a really great author's written, and let's rewrite it. We can acknowledge them, because this is just for one child. And can we use that as a format and then write them their own story? There's something really powerful for children to read the story of that person, that my memories of my dad, and also for us to be able to give some helpful messages about what happened when that person died. And maybe we want the child to know that the doctors did everything they could, because that might be really important for that child in not making a meaning that my dad was let down. And that there was a funeral and lots of people came to celebrate, not so much in times of COVID, but more broadly than that. We can then include those important messages that we want the child to have, and they can revisit that story. And where we can, let's involve them in writing it. Let's bring the kind of framework and involve them in writing that story.
Can I just add as well a couple of things? A lot of children, especially younger children, love role play, love stories, love puppets, and it's if that's their strength, if that's not something that they love to do, and they feel safe and secure in that medium, let's use it to to support them through that. But we'll give a little bit of a bit of a warning. Please make sure you read the story first, so that you're not reading alongside them, because that could perhaps trigger some emotions in you, because some of the stories are actually quite powerful for us as adults as well. So make sure that you feel confident in reading that story before you read it to an audience.
Thank you, Jamie. And Beck, if you have got any recommendations that come to you afterwards, we could add that in when we send out the slides. We could send out some signposting to key resources that might be useful. So this next question sort of leads on from that, really, and the person has asked, would your advice differ according to age group? So do we need to think differently when we're talking with early years or through the key stages? And this person that asked the question said they're working with a child or a young person that's 17. Does the advice change according to the age of the child? David, I'll come to you first.
Well, yes and no is the answer to that.
Okay.
No, in that we're still trying to help them to process the event of the death so that they can grieve the loss of the person. Okay, so that bit is the same, but obviously the way you do that with a 5-year-old is different to how you're going to do that with a 17-year-old. So we have to meet them where they're at. It's not just about age, it's about their own interest, their own ability. So we have to work out how we're going to help them with those particular tasks. But the actual, for me, the kind of the universal task is the same, but the way we help them to achieve it is going to be different. I'm sure Beck will have something to add.
No, that would be that the principles are the same, but making it accessible to the child or young person develop based on their age, their cognitive development, their interests. Can we engage them in a way that's meaningful for them? But I think the principles are largely the same. And again, in the schools guide, you'll see some different resources for different age groups that might be useful.
Helpful, thank you. We've had a few questions in around supporting children and young people with a parent that might have a terminal illness or a friend or someone close to them, and thinking about if you've got any special advice or if you could link or signpost any resources that might be useful. And also we had a question in from someone who's working with a child that's experiencing that. They're going through the death of a parent, but also it's a parent who they do not have a good relationship with. So it's quite complicated, it's quite complex. So it'd be really helpful to hear the panel's thoughts about particularly thinking about children experiencing death through terminal illness of their parents or loved ones.
I'll go first if that's all right, before I forget what I want to say.
Okay.
I think it's a really interesting question. I don't know if it came up, but I put 2 resources that might be of use. One for Child Bereavement UK and one at Winston's Wish. They both have some really nice resources for helping you to work with children who are expecting a parent to die, someone who's terminally ill. And what's interesting, I think, from a research point of view, is that an expected death does not necessarily mean it won't be traumatic. And there was some really interesting research that compared sudden and unexpected deaths to expected and sort of lasting illness deaths, and they found just the same amount of post-traumatic stress disorder, just the same amount of complicated grief. And we think that's because even if you know someone is going to die, even if someone has told you, 2 things happen. One is there's a bit of you that doesn't want to believe it, and you're always kind of hanging on to a bit of hope. But also along that road, quite often there will be some pretty traumatic elements of that. You might witness a resuscitation, or you might imagine something that's happened. So even if it's expected, there's still plenty of potential for that death to be traumatic. And I think anything where you can help the young person to acknowledge what's going to happen and prepare them as much as you're able to with that, making these things talkable about rather than sweeping them under the carpet, I think is really important.
Shall I chip in as well?
Thank you.
As is my way. Yeah, absolutely building on what David was saying, but also recognising that sometimes the parents aren't ready to share that information, and therefore the adults around them in school might know something that hasn't been shared with. So this really is where the collaboration and connection with the family is super important. And I'd also encourage schools that are facing this to make connections with your local hospice. Whether or not the family are being supported, they're often a great place that can offer resources and direct support. And it may be there's something for the children to access, even if the adults aren't accessing that. So it's worth checking out what your local service, and as well as those resources that David's put in there from Child Bereavement UK and Winston's Wish, Macmillan have got some fab resources about supporting a child. If you're a child that's supporting your parent when they're facing their death. So there's some other bits there as well.
That's helpful, thank you. So my next question is about what advice would you give for supporting students and staff who've experienced a sudden death or traumatic bereavement within the school community? So thinking about the sudden death of a student or a teacher, for example, any information or advice that you could give for the whole school community? And I might start with you again, David.
I mean, well, I know this isn't going to be that helpful, but our next set of resources from UK Trauma Council is about helping schools deal with critical incidents. So in 6 months' time, we'll have some actual resources to go along with this. Whenever we work with schools, I mean, one of the good things you've got there, it's good and bad, isn't it? Because you're dealing with the whole school community, which on the one hand is going to be even more complicated. It's not just one child in one class, it's the whole school is affected, and that's going to make life a bit more difficult. But also it does mean that you've got this shared traumatic event, this shared grieving, and you can tap into that. So that social support following traumatic events is absolutely crucial. We know that lack of social support is a risk factor for PTSD. So the more we can do to keep that community going and provide that support, the better it's going to be for children. So very often when we work with schools following any sort of critical incident, there's 5 principles that we try and draw on. And one is about helping the children to feel safe, despite whatever it has happened. How can you, because you know your children better than the outsiders, how can you help the children to feel safe? How can you help them to feel calm and regulate their emotions? How can you help them to feel connected and supported? How can you help them to feel like they have some sort of control over what's going on around them and some choices? And how can you help them to feel hopeful about the future? So those 5 principles would be, they're based on a review of the literature about what creates the best possible environment that's most likely to promote recovery. So that would be my advice, to think about those 5 principles.
Thank you, David. That's helpful. Beck, anything you wanted to add, or Jamie?
I think sometimes I like to consider, with all those principles that David's mentioned, almost that we're thinking about a buffet or a pick and mix of support, that different young people, different children and different staff members will want different things at different times. And rather than a school going, this is what we're going to do, having some buffet makes it sound like some delights, but what I mean is kind of a selection of things at different times that different pupils and different staff members can opt in and out of. Sometimes we think we can identify the children most that are most affected, and actually in my experience we miss the child who always sat next to that child in spelling tests and now doesn't have anyone to mark their spellings. We miss. So if we can offer with an open invitation, whilst that might be more difficult to manage, we can allow different children and different members of staff to opt in and out and get the support that they need at different times that they need it. That would be kind of one additional thing.
I was just going to add as well, is about the adults are kind of like going to be the drivers in this, really, and so for the adults to make sure that they are looking out for their own emotions with this and how they are dealing with it, and to look at about things, what can I do today, what can I do tomorrow, what can I do next week, so that they're not thinking that everything that they have to do straight away, because they're not going to be able to do referrals for every single child by the end of the week. But it's about prioritising their own well-being, as well as obviously the well-being for the children in their school. But it's about making sure that they can, as Beck's buffet metaphor, making sure that they're not expecting to prepare the whole buffet in one day. Because I think otherwise it's going to be overwhelming for the staff as well. And obviously the whole community, in terms of parents, are going to be wanting to do certain things, and it's about making sure that the family have got certain controls over that, because do they want the whole balloon memorials, whereas actually it might be too soon for the family to witness things like that. So it's about making sure that the family have a certain amount of control over what's happening within the school community as well.
Thank you, Jamie. I've got a collection of questions about referrals now. So if we just sort of have a think about making referral. The first one is some people obviously experiencing that you're on a long waiting list. If you make a specialist referral, that could take some time. And the question is, will the work still have good impact? If a child is on a waiting list for a long time, by the time they get to see a specialist, is that still going to have the same impact? And what can you be doing with that child while they're waiting for that specialist referral?
I think Beck should answer that one, because I think that's a whole tiers of support, which is a great analogy for it, really.
Yeah, this is a really tricky one. We know that mental health services don't have the capacity that they would want to have, as well as we would want them to have. So I think thinking about all that support that we can offer is still relevant. I think where there's risk involved, where we're really concerned about that child's or young person's ability to keep themselves safe, keep pushing the button, keep pressing the referral. Have a look at what the schools guide can offer you in terms of connection. Support can come somewhere down the line. and that can still be really valid and helpful. I've worked with young people even 10 years after the death of someone, where the meaning they now made of it meant that they needed support in a different way at a different level. And have a look at your CAMS or local NHS service, but also look at your bereavement services and other, there's lots of other third sector organisations that might be able to offer some support that will still be really relevant and helpful and meaningful to that child or young person.
Can I also add as well, I mean, obviously in Kent we have our local inclusion forum team, because obviously the school down the road might have had the same experiences that you're having to manage now, so making sure that you have a network of colleagues around you that may have had to manage similar situations previous. So it's about using the network around you, and obviously the waiting list is nothing that anybody would want, but it's about keeping, you know, the here and now and managing the moment as well as looking out. And yes, as Beck said, I think the outcomes will be perhaps not as great as we'd like because of the waiting list, but it's better than not putting them on the waiting list because the waiting list is too much.
Yeah.
And I personally have this thing about, even when we know the waiting list is long, still put the referral in, because how do the commissioners know how big the demand is unless everybody still makes those referrals? Sometimes I hear a sense of, oh, there's no point us putting a referral in, we know this won't meet threshold, or there's too big a waiting list. But I would still argue, I don't want to waste people's time, but if you think it warrants that level of service, put the referral in so that the commissioners know what the level of demand is.
Yeah, I would really agree with that, Beck, absolutely. And just connected to that, a colleague who's working in an FE college has said, have you got any advice for a young person that's actually just turned 18? Who could they make a referral to? What would be the best place to refer someone who's still in college but is actually 18?
Yeah, I would look to those local bereavement services. Child Bereavement UK certainly support young adults up to 25, and it may be that your local service does, or while so many not good things have happened in COVID, one benefit is that organisations have had to be more creative in how they offer support. So some of those services that would have been considered more localised and might have been out of the location for that young person might be able to offer some remote support. So I definitely look at Winston's, Wish and CB UK, but maybe your local service goes above 18. I think there's a large appreciation that the kind of support you might need up to 18 doesn't change a day later, and that you can still benefit from the peer support as well as the specialist support.
Thank you. And just to confirm, Beck, we've got colleagues on the call today who are not in an education setting, they're outside of that. They can still make referrals to both those organisations that you just named, can't they? Anyone can refer in. Most
of those organisations have an open access referral policy, and if they don't, they'll let you know who, and then you can liaise with, if it has to have parental consent at this stage, or parent or carer consent, you can seek that, but be guided by those specific referrals.
Thank you. Now, Beck and David, this might be covered in your resource, but someone's asked, is there a kind of really easy go-to activity that you can do with a child or young person that will help you gauge whether they're experiencing traumatic bereavement? Is there something that's really practical that people can do if they're a bit worried and they're not quite sure, that they could sit down with a child and try and work out what sort of bereavement they're experiencing?
Please jump in. There's a number of things that I use, but it's really hard without knowing the age, the circumstances, how this young person's presenting to say, this is the one activity. And sometimes it might be that we do a coping line, things that are going really well in my life and things that are really hard. And we invite the young person or the child to place things on in their life. Is breakfast really hard now? And it might be because Dad used to do breakfast and now it really sucks because the other person who's now looking after me doesn't get it. We can kind of just see visually how many things are they placing down the hard end, and what are we getting from the conversation we're having. I don't think it's so much about counting the post-its at the end and saying, well, there's lots. It's about the conversation we're having with them then, and are we getting a sense that lots of areas of life are very difficult, or maybe only a few areas are difficult, but they're really difficult and they're really having an impact. And something like that might give us a sense. And even with young children, we can do that with counters and coins and using Lego, whatever, but kind of getting a sense. There are others, but that would be kind of maybe a bit of a go-to there. But David, you might want to jump in with.
No, I'm just writing all those down, Beck. That's really helpful. I mean, I would add, I like a questionnaire, you know, and I know it's not very creative, but I think some of the young people I work with quite enjoy doing a questionnaire. One boy said to me just last week, it was a remote session. He said, my mouth can't tell you, but my fingers can. And what he meant by that was bring up another one of those questionnaires and I'll tick the boxes for you. And again, in the resource, there's a number of questionnaires, one looking at intrusions and avoidance of the memories of the death, and one about the way they see things, the way they now see the world. And I'm not interested in the scores that those questionnaires generate. What I'm interested in is the conversations you have around those items. And sometimes they can generate conversations that a straightforward sort of interaction can't. Yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Can I just mention that those questionnaires you'll find in the clinical guide rather than the schools guide, but there's a lot of information about how to use those. And as schools, you'll be used to, you know, using different types of measures and ideas of when you're screening children and young people for well-being or dyslexia. So I think using some of those same principles, you can look within the clinical guide to find some of those measures that might be useful for traumatic bereavement specifically.
Thanks, Beck. And again, we can link to that, can't we? We can send that out. I'm really conscious of time, but there's a few more questions. I'm going to try and whiz through them if I can. Quick question is, what can you do if there's a child or young person that experienced bereavement and is not having the opportunity to talk about the loved one that's died because their wider family don't want to talk about it, so their memories are not, they can't access it, no one's talking about it, the memories being dimmed of that person that they love that's died. Any advice there? Jaime?
I think it's, you know, it's, I guess it's our responsibility to give them opportunities to be able to talk about it. So if they want to talk about it, that's a massive step forward, because I think a lot of our, you know, children and young people, you know, kind of withdraw and don't want to talk about it. So the fact that they do want to talk about it is our responsibility to give them those opportunities, and looking at what their interests are, what they like to do. So, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be as a counselling session. Can you go for a walk together? Can you go for, you know, do an art session together? Can you play together? And not necessarily them play and you watch, it's you play together and you're playing with the same objects, and you've got the same piece of paper, you've got the same colouring pencils together, and so that it's that real joint opportunity to talk about things, rather than just sitting down and having that discussion as a formal chat, really. But yeah, so that would be my gut instinct to answer that question, really.
Thank you. Beck, do you want to add anything?
I was thinking, but now I've forgotten. I'm sorry, my brain's full up.
It's always the way. David, quick question for you. Have you got any resources or anything you can direct people to in relation to secondary trauma?
Yes. So, I mean, those 5 principles I talked about for school actually are really protective for us as well. I think supervision, whether that's where you have a formal supervisor or you have someone, it might be a peer, where you get to stop and think things through, because the problem with trauma is when we don't get to think it through, we don't get to process it because it's so upsetting, so we try and push it away. So anything that allows you to kind of defragment your memories, you know, if that's talking to the dog at the end of the day, that's going to be useful. Some way of taking the stuff that's happened when you're ready to do this and to think it through, I think is going to be really useful. And increasingly, there's some more and more self-care webinars. So Child Bereavement UK will often do that. I know the National Bereavement Partnership does a series of self-care webinars and things. So there are places you can go to get that. But I think good old-fashioned tea and cake, and it's not the tea and cake that's useful, actually, it's the spending time with fellow human beings and just taking a breath, because if you're going to drink a cup of tea, you've got to stop and take a breath, and just having a bit of a chat about what sort of day you're having. You know, I think we sometimes underestimate the power of that.
Thank you. And Beck, I just have got one last question that I really want to get to in relation to the fantastic resources that you've shared today and that you've are going to give out to people. How could people adjust those for children and young people that might have special educational needs? And the question is particularly around children that might be deaf.
Okay, yeah, that's a real thought. I think what we've tried to do when we've developed these resources is make them, the principles, appropriate to all children. And I guess if we're measuring the impact of this grief on that child, not on their peers or other children of different ages. So we're really thinking about recognizing their difficulties in relation to themselves. And in doing that, we're able to be very mindful of any additional needs, or in this case, a child who's got a sensory impairment. And then I'd really think about, what do you usually do to access and engage and communicate with this young person? Because the same things apply. We're just going to be doing it around a slightly different subject matter. So I don't think I would be changing massively what we're doing, but thinking about the communication tools we would usually use, and how as adults in school do we usually engage with this young person, and being mindful that that young person who is deaf might have found it more difficult to be included in some of the chance conversations around things, and need something much more direct. So us really giving them that additional time that they might need to make sense of and communicate their grief, so we can unpick how the impact it's having on them.
Thank you, Beck. Right, I must draw to a close there. I have now failed to keep us to time, so I've failed as a chair, but there were so many questions and the discussion was so rich, so I just really appreciate it, and I'm sorry that we've slightly run over. I just want to take the opportunity to thank our speakers. Thank you to David, to Beck and to Jaime. Just such a fantastic and interesting webinar that we've just had, and really what I like most is the amount of practical ideas and resources and things that people can take away and use tomorrow in schools and in classrooms. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for the whole audience for joining us. Delighted to have you with us on this sunny afternoon. Thank you for staying. When the webinar finishes, you're going to be directed to a feedback form. We'd really appreciate it if you would fill it in, give us your feedback, let us know if you enjoyed the webinar, what you liked, what you didn't like, or just share any information with us via our email address as well, just so that we can make sure that we're meeting the needs of the audience. But I would just like to say thank you very much. Thank you to the panel, and thank you to the audience for joining us, and take good care of yourselves, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Take care. Goodbye.
Bye.